These investors accidentally had to pay $66,000 in tax to the government, and you might think, how's that possible when we don't have a capital gains tax in New Zealand? Well, we kind of do. It's called the Brightline test. Before I get into the case studies, what's the Brightline test? So let's say you purchased this property in 2020 and you sold it 3 years later in 2023. You originally bought it for $700K, and by the time you sold it, hey, it had gone up in value, now worth $850,000. So you made a profit of $150K. Now, if you're caught under the Brightline test, you have to pay tax on this. And depending on your tax rate, in this case, you would pay almost $50,000 to the IRD. But it's really important to note that not every property has to pay tax like this. So before we get into the people who accidentally had to pay $66,000 in tax, let's talk about Kiwis who would get away scot-free. Let's say you purchase this property and you're going to use it as an investment property. Now, you originally purchased it for $600,000, and by the time you sold it for $1 million. It had gone up in value. So you effectively made a profit of $400K. And you might think, holy heck, I'm going to have to pay a lot of tax on this because I'm using it as an investment property. Well, because you purchased it in 2019, your Brightline period would be 5 years. So if you sell this property within 5 years of purchasing it, then yep, you are going to pay tax on that $400K. But if we transport ourselves into the future and actually you sold this property in 2026, well, you owned that property for perhaps 6 or 7 years, in which case you would not have to pay tax at all because you are outside of that Brightline period. And it's important to note that Brightline lasts for different periods because these guys, John Key and Jacinda Ardern, kept on changing how long the Brightline was. So if you purchase a property before March 2018, there's actually no Brightline test anymore. You're well outside it. For anything purchased between 2018 and 2021, your Brightline test will be 5 years. Now, any properties purchased after March 2021 that are new builds, your Brightline test is going to be 5 years. But if you've purchased an existing property, i.e. not a new build, then your Brightline test will be 10 years. So one way to get around the Brightline test, just hold your property longer than however long your Brightline period is. Now let's go through one of the case studies where an investor accidentally had to pay tax. And if you know anything about the Brightline, you might be saying, hang on, Ed, I know that if I buy a house and I live in it, it's my own home, I don't have to pay the Brightline either. Well, that's not always the case. Let me take you through an example. So you decided to buy this house and you were going to use it as your own home. You paid $450K on it, and then you thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to renovate the property and then I'm going to sell it for more than I bought it for, and I'm not going to have to pay tax because it's my own home. Well, what would happen? You sold it for $600K, you made a gross profit of $150K, but look, you've got to pay for your renovations, you've got to pay for your sales costs, that's your real estate agent. All up, you spent $80K on that, and so your net profit was $70,000. You paid no tax at all because it was your own home, and you did this all within 4 months. So you made 70 grand in 4 months, didn't have to pay tax, and boy, you're feeling pretty clever. So what do? You decide, hey, I'm going to do this all again. So you're going to buy this property as your own home, and this time you pay $500K on it, sell it for $650, you made $150K, you also had some renovation costs. All up, you made $52.5 grand, and because it's your own home, 0% tax, didn't pay anything, and you made $52.5 grand in 6 months, and oh, you're feeling really clever, so you say, hey, I'm going to do it again. You think third time lucky, so you purchased this again as your own home. You paid $700, sold it for $900K, you made $200, but again, you spent some money on the renovation and some sales costs. All up, that's $130K, and you made a net profit of $70K. But then what happens? Ring, 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 ring. It's the IRD. They want their money because you have to pay tax on this property. And you might say, well, hang on, Ed, this is my own home. I thought there was an exemption for your own home. And there is, but the Brightline test is an intention-based test. So if the IRD looks at you and says, hang on, you never intended to live in these properties, you purchased them in order to make a profit by renovating them. So because that was your intention, you have to pay tax. And you might say, well, how do they know that was my intention? Well, if you buy and sell properties like I've just shown you, and you do that more than twice in a 2-year period, the IRD will come back and they'll probably not just want their tax based on this property, but on these other properties as well, because they'll say your intention was never to live in here, your intention was to make a profit. So these guys would have to pay potentially 33% tax on their net profit. So these guys would have to pay $23,000 to the IRD. So this is the level of detail you need to get into when you're investing in property so you don't accidentally break the rules. And one way to learn those details is subscribing to our YouTube channel. We release new videos every Monday and Wednesday. And speaking of details, here is what our next property investor missed. Many Kiwis think that you only have to pay tax under the Brightline if you buy an investment property. Not true. So these Kiwis purchased this property as a holiday home in Queenstown. They lived up in Auckland and they purchased this in 2019. That means they've got a Brightline period of 5 years. Now, it doesn't matter that this isn't an investment property because it's not their main home. If they sell this property within 5 years, they've got to pay tax. Now, these guys sold it in 2021 and only owned it for 2 years. So, yep, 2 years, less than 5 years, got to pay tax. They originally paid 1.6 mil for the property, and because the market had gone up in value, they sold it for 1.8. Now, they did have some sales costs. You've got to pay for your real estate agent, your lawyer, the marketing fees for the property, and potentially some money to stage it, make it look nice. So they made a profit of $110,000, and they've got to pay tax on this. Now, the question is, how much tax do they have to pay? And this is where the Brightline test gets really complicated if you don't own your property in a trust or in a limited liability company. And the reason is that under the Brightline, they will take this $110,000 and they will add it to your personal income. The tax rate you pay is based on how much you earn because we have a progressive tax system in New Zealand. So if you earn more money, you are going to pay more tax on your property sale or on your property profits compared to if you had a lower income. I want to give you some examples just so you can really understand this. So the way it works is, let's say you don't earn an income at all. Well, if you don't earn an income, you don't pay tax. Well, you earned $110,000 from this property sale, so they will say your total income is $110,000. Now, if you go online to a calculator like paye.net.nz and you put in $110,000, you will see that your effective tax rate is about 26%. Now, if you take out some of the extra things you're actually not going to have to pay, works out to be about 25% tax. Well, what happens if you earn a higher income? Well, let's say you earn $190,000. Really, really strong income. Well, what's going to happen is they're going to take that $110K that you earned through the property and say, well, your total income is now $300,000. So while the person on the low income or no income had to pay 24% tax on their property gains, the person on the higher income actually has to pay 39%. And if we plug that in over here, the person paying the lower amount of tax is going to pay $27,500 to the IRD. But if you had that higher personal income and had to pay 39% tax, you'd have to pay almost $16,000 more. You'd be paying almost $43,000 to the IRD. And so the Brightline test starts to get really complicated, and it can even get more complicated if you own this property with your partner and you guys are earning different incomes. Well, you guys are going to pay different tax rates. It gets even more complicated if you lived in this property yourself as your main home for a couple of years, because then you'd get a partial use of the main home exemption. Look, there are a whole heap of rules, so if you want to learn them all, check out this article on our website. It takes you through everything you need to know in terms of whether you are going to have to pay tax under the Brightline test. But despite all of that, these two case studies alone show that these two investors had to pay $66,000 to the IRD and didn't even mean to. Now, that might have you thinking, holy heck, how do I make sure that I don't have to pay tax under the Brightline test? If you really don't want to pay tax on your capital gains on property, there's 3 ways to do it. First, use the property as your main home. No Brightline test at all, but that's only going to work for your first property. The second thing is to buy an investment property or a holiday home and hold it for the long term, 10 years or more. The third thing you can do is invest in new builds. Now, these have that shorter 5-year Brightline test. And if you want to buy a new build, invest in new builds, and hold them for the long term, check out our website, opuspartners.co.nz. We help regular Kiwis grow their wealth through new build investment properties.